So what I've been thinking about recently is that we may be living through COVID as if we don't trust Jesus. The things that we do, the things we think and say may show that we're actually more afraid of COVID than of hell. And we're more concerned about avoiding the virus than we are about not sinning. We are about seeing our Father glorified in the way that we live. Even though we trust in our hearts and we say that Jesus is Lord, and because trusting gets us up on a Sunday morning, right? Thank you for being here. But the thing is, in this story, I wholeheartedly believe that the disciples would have also said that they trusted Jesus before heading out on the boat. But their actions showed that they didn't trust Jesus to be capable. And so what I want to do today is have a look at the passage, look carefully at what is said, and then have a think about what it means for us as we try to trust Jesus, or as we do trust Jesus. But let's pray as we get started. Father, thank you for your word. Please open our eyes to see what you have to say, our ears to hear, and our hearts that we would change. Amen. And so our passage begins as Jesus finishes speaking to the crowd. Remember, at the beginning of chapter 4, Jesus went out on a boat so he could speak to the large crowd. And he's been speaking to them about all the good and wonderful things of God's kingdom. But in our passage, time has passed and now evening has come, and Jesus decides he wants to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He's already in the boat, and so they decide just to sorry, my dog is attacking the stand. They decide to get in the boat and just leave. And some other boats go with him as well. But let's have a look at that passage. Have a look at the passage now. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. And so after a period of time, the wind picks up, and with wind comes large waves. And even though they were in a lake, an enclosed body of water, the waves get bigger and bigger and bigger. And remember that many of the disciples are experienced fishermen. They've lived through storms, they've worked through storms. So there isn't really much reason why they would be frightened unless the storm was of great magnitude. And so freak weather is the right description for what's happening in our passage today. And the disciples are terrified. Let's have a look at the next verse. Oh, that's not the next verse. This is the next verse. Jesus was in a stern, sleeping on the cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And by the time we get to here, it's panic stations, full-on panic stations. And director Mark actually leaves a lot to the imagination. Perhaps maybe one or two men were struggling at the helm, trying to steer the boat, another one or two wrestling with whatever was left of the sail, and the rest of them with a bucket trying to bail out and bilge the boat. And so imagine their surprise as they find Jesus asleep on the boat. Now, for those of you who are visually minded, like me, I've always struggled to see how Jesus could sleep in a dinghy. And so I found a little model of what the boat might have looked like. There's a little compartment. So this is the rear of the boat. And there's a little compartment back here where Jesus may have slept in. But this is how I imagine it. And so they find him asleep in the back of the boat, even though the boat is crashing and jolting as it's buffeted around by the swell. And this is when tempers flare. And the disciples unleash their anger and fear on Jesus. And in their speech, there are two things that I want to explore with you. The first is how they address Jesus. They address him as rabbi or teacher. And in Mark, anytime someone refers to Jesus as rabbi or teacher, they say something wrong about Jesus. They assume something about him, or they misunderstand Jesus. And so here, director Mark gives us a little wink that what the disciples are about to say is wrong. The second thing is what they say to Jesus. Even though it already seems quite pointy, our English translations can actually downplay what they say to Jesus. And so what the vibe we get here is something a bit more like this. Teacher, is it even a care for you if we drown? And it's really hard to say this kind of statement without a degree of sass. You know, is it a care for you if we drown? But they're almost trying to, well, not almost, they're rebuking Jesus for his lack of action at this point. Is it a care for you that we are dying? They call for Jesus to give a toss, to get up, grab a bucket, and help them, possibly, beyond all hope, survive the storm. And so in this statement, we see another two things. Firstly, they accuse Jesus of not caring for them. And secondly, they show they don't believe Jesus is capable of saving them. And these two statements are incredibly insulting to Jesus. First, that Jesus doesn't care for them. Now, this is a magnificently ignorant thing to say to God. After he has ascended from his throne on high, become a man plagued by the aches and pains and sickness caused by sin, and is heading towards, with full knowledge, an exceedingly painful and torturous death. Also, he can save his accusers from their own sin. And so to accuse Jesus of not caring is like accusing water of not being wet enough. It's like accusing, sorry, I lost my place. It's like accusing the sun of not being sunny enough. Jesus came because he cares, because he loves. And caring is exactly why he came, exactly what he came to do, and what he continues to do at the Father's side, as we read before in 1 John 2. Secondly, they don't believe Jesus is able to save them. Now, they do come to Jesus and ask for help, but it's not what we think it is. It's not what we might import into the passage. They come across and speak to Jesus about the certain death which is coming to them. And the way they say it, they're not asking Jesus to stand up and do a miracle. In fact, it's highly unlikely they would have ever thought Jesus capable of moving to the front of the boat, raising his hands, and bellowing at nature to make it stop. Rather, I think they would have expected him to do anything at all, bailing out the water, help with the sails, do anything to help them survive. In short, they treated him like a normal man, and they forgot his great supernatural powers. In their time of need, when they should have been reaching out to him as the Son of God, they reached out to him as a man, and they rebuked him for his lack of effort. So how does Jesus respond? Well, in short, he rebukes everything. Let's have a look at the passage. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." So he rebukes everything, quite literally. But maybe it's not how we imagine it. Now, come with me here. In our mind's eye, I think we might see Jesus rising from the cushion, walking calmly to the front of the boat and standing tall on the gunwale with all the sea wash flying around him and his hair streaming behind him majestically as he reaches forward with two arms and declares commandments over nature. But here's an alternative version for you. Jesus doesn't even leave the cushion. In fact, like a tired teen refusing to believe it's almost midday, he stays in the bed and speaks in frustration to his creation. And so instead of imagining Jesus standing tall at the front of the boat, I want our NIVs, they want to paint this dramatic picture for us. But Mark only uses one word to describe what Jesus does here, and it's wake up. So it may be that instead of Jesus standing at the front of the boat, he just rolls over and yells out in frustration, "Oi, shut it." While it's not the graceful image we like, or the epic image we like, it's the image that Mark paints for us. But why? Isn't the dramatic better? Why doesn't director Mark paint this huge scene for us with lots of verses describing the size of the storm and the fear of the disciples, much like he will do in the next chapter with the Gerasene demoniac? Well, because Jesus didn't need to. Jesus doesn't need to. Such is Jesus's power and authority that he can control time and space from his bed. In fact, we know that Jesus didn't even need to speak in order to control these things. That's how powerful he is. And so then he turns to his disciples and he rebukes them. And Jesus literally here calls them cowards because their panic shows they didn't trust Jesus. They didn't trust his power to protect and to save them. Jesus is frustrated by their fear because across the Bible, fear is the opposite to faith. Fear shows that you don't have faith. And there are lots of cries, particularly throughout the Old Testament, where the protagonist is called to be brave, to not fear, to have faith in God. But the attitude the disciples show is complete fear and no trust. And this is the main point of the passage for us today, that Jesus is worthy of our trust because he has great power. He is worthy of the trust of the disciples and is worthy of our trust now. But here's the kicker. I believe that every single one of those disciples would have said they trusted Jesus as they headed out on the boat. They would have all said they trusted Jesus with their life. They would have all said that they know he has great power. But their actions didn't show it. And I find it difficult not to compare myself with these people and their lack of trust. But the good news is we don't have to. Because we have our own problems, don't we? We have our own issues that we either can cling to Jesus in, or we can try and fix ourselves and control ourselves. Usually the problem is bigger than ourselves. And so our effort to try and fix anything becomes futile, like disciples bailing out water only to have it washed back into the boat. And so what's our problem now? Well, it's COVID, of course, isn't it? That's our shared experience. That's our trial of faith. And so I fear that Christians now, we can be caught in fear rather than trusting Jesus, even though in our hearts we say that we trust Jesus with our lives. So, I sat down with some of my youth and kids leaders over the last few weeks, and we talked about what would it look like for a Christian who doesn't trust Jesus during COVID versus a Christian that does. And here are some of the things we came up with. Not trusting Jesus through the pandemic could leave someone feeling very stressed and afraid. They could feel great anxiety around COVID and spread, and they would feel extremely worried about getting it and spreading it to others. This could lead them to get caught up in all the news and everything related with what's happening to it, needing to watch the 11 a.m. report every day, spending copious amount of time reading the news, researching the news, tracking where the disease is heading, constantly thinking about it. And whenever they speak to someone, they always talk about COVID. They always talk about COVID. They try to control everything around them in order to protect themselves from the disease. And this is really sad because it demonstrates a lack of trust, because the person begins to worship their fear of COVID over the God who can control it. They prioritize listening to Gladys at 11 a.m. rather than coming to Jesus in his word, looking for salvation from the state government rather than the God who deals all of it. In fact, they read more news than they do Bible. COVID consumes any prayer time they may have, and they may even question if Jesus is working at all through the pandemic. And whenever they speak to anyone, it's always about COVID. It's not about Jesus. They look down on others for their lack of awareness or lack of care, and they may take an extreme pro or anti-vax view. And they sometimes take this to social media to proclaim to all their followers their gospel of vaccine or anti-vaccine. They're more concerned about someone's vaccination status than their relationship with Jesus. And in fact, they've possibly stopped caring about Jesus in other people's lives a long time ago and began instead sharing that gospel of COVID or vaccine. Now, many of us might see ourselves in that description, or a couple of things. And so if that's the case, then there are warning signs that we need to turn back and trust Jesus. So what does it look like to trust Jesus through a pandemic? Well, we know Jesus is in control. And we know that he will do what he wants with the virus. And so we can actually relax. We aren't so concerned with catching the news. Yes, it's important to hear and to know what's going on, but knowing the numbers isn't as important as praying for my city, not just praying for healing, but praying for revival. We continue to pray that people would come to know Jesus and love him more, not just stay safe from the disease, the virus rather. And we're committed to pastorally caring for other people. It's hard. Other people are isolated, maybe not as isolated as us. But instead of using COVID as a barrier to disconnect myself from other people, instead I try and go through that with the good news of Jesus. When we speak the gospel, and we bring the hope that Jesus has brought to us and support others spiritually and encourage them. We seek to share that gospel whenever we can. And yeah, we can be real. It's frustrating. And we're frustrated with the state of the world and how everything is online. But that hasn't stopped us with participating in the online programs and still trying to encourage other people, even with our presence online. We still grieve things that are cancelled, but we look forward to the bright future to come. And we follow state laws and we practice good health in line with the recommendations, seeking to obey the authorities that God has put in control. In short, to be a person who doesn't trust Jesus is to try and be in control of their whole surroundings. But in the end, we just panic. The person who trusts Jesus is calm, knowing that God is in control. And know the government will do their job, and there's nothing that we can say or do it's nothing that they can say or do to take away the security that I have in Jesus. And so we continue to prioritize listening to Jesus. Or as someone said a couple of weeks ago, we trust Jesus, then Gladys. Now, part of trusting Jesus is acknowledging that he has his own timing for everything. We want the pandemic gone now, don't we? I want to reconnect with everyone now, don't I? It's almost like I'm not really living my life until I get it back to normal. We thought it was finished last year, and we started living like it was. But our timing is not always God's timing. And part of trusting Jesus means that I give that over to him. One commentator I read this week was talking about Jesus' timing. He let the storm develop. He let it grow, and he allowed fear to reign over the boat before the disciples woke him. That was according to his design. And then he chose to calm everything. And he demonstrated his power and glory, his worthiness of the disciples and our trust. Jesus works in his own timing. We are not him. He sets his own designs according to him. And even though October 18 may come and go, and we may face more lockdowns and more strains and booster shots and vaccine passports, it does not mean that Jesus is not working. And it doesn't mean that I'm separated from Jesus's love for me. But instead, my mission continues the same as it always has, to live in a way which proclaims the gospel, to speak it and to live it, so that my God is glorified and those around me know. For the disciples, faith is accepting that Jesus is in control. And for us, it's the same, accepting that he is in control. And if we believe that the pandemic cannot thwart the gospel, then our lives will show it. And we'll live in such a way where we care about the physical health of others, but the gospel is the number one priority for us. And see, as the story wraps up, if you have a look back at the passage, the heartbreaking thing about this passage is they ask each other at the end, who is Jesus? Who is this person? And other gospels say, what kind of man is this? So even after all this, after all Jesus has said and done, they still don't understand who Jesus is. But we're not at liberty to do this. So we have the word, we have evidence, we have one another. And so for us, we can understand who Jesus is. And there's no excuse like there might have been for the disciples here. There's no excuse for those of us who call ourselves Christians to not trust Jesus through something that he has already demonstrated he has complete control over. And so where I want to leave us today is to examine our hearts. Do I trust Jesus? Is the way I'm living now show that he's in control? Am I living in fear, or am I living in faith?